What would you do if a 7-year-old girl looked at a billionaire mafia boss in the middle of a luxury Manhattan gala and said, "Dad, that girl has my face"? That single moment froze Daniel Kong in place as if the entire world had stopped breathing around him. The grand ballroom of the Hudson Crest Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and guests wearing outfits worth more than most homes in America. Yet none of that mattered the moment Amara Johnson tightened her small grip around Daniel's tailored suit sleeve. He had faced CEOs, rivals, and international negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars without blinking, but nothing had ever made him feel what he felt right now. A strange, unfamiliar hesitation he could not explain. Amara was just 7 years old, dressed in a simple navy blue dress she had worn from school earlier that day, her tiny shoes slightly worn at the edges from walking through the Bronx streets with her mother. She should not have belonged in a place like this, surrounded by people whose watches alone cost more than $20,000. Yet her eyes were locked forward with absolute certainty as she pointed toward the grand projection screen displaying sponsor highlights of the event. On that screen, a young VIP girl from an influential donor family smiled politely for cameras. Her blonde hair curled perfectly, her posture trained, her presence polished to perfection. But Amara wasn't looking at status or wealth. She was staring at identity. "That girl. She looks exactly like me," she repeated softly, her voice carrying a tone too calm for a child, yet sharp enough to cut through the noise of clinking glasses and quiet conversations. Daniel's expression did not change outwardly, but internally something shifted in a way he had not experienced in years. His entire life had been built on observation, calculation, and control, yet this statement disrupted every instinct he trusted. He looked at the screen, then back at Amara, searching for logic, coincidence, anything that could anchor reality back into place. The gala continued around them as if nothing unusual had happened. Wealthy guests laughing softly, investors exchanging business cards, servers moving like shadows between tables carrying champagne worth $300 a bottle. But Daniel felt as if a silent spotlight had isolated them in the middle of it all. Amara did not look confused or playful. She looked certain. That certainty was what unsettled him the most. Her small finger remained pointed at the screen, and for a brief moment Daniel noticed something subtle he had initially ignored: the shape of the girl's face, the spacing of her eyes, even the natural tilt of her head bore a resemblance too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Yet what truly unsettled him was not the resemblance itself, but the way Amara recognized it instantly, instinctively, as if something deep inside her had already known before she even spoke. Daniel slowly lowered his gaze to her, his mind trying to impose order on something that refused categorization. He had no record of this child beyond what he knew from brief interactions at the charity event. Selena Johnson's daughter, an employee in the catering staff with no connection to his world. And yet Amara's words had introduced a fracture into that assumption. Around them, the gala lights flickered slightly as if reacting to a shift in atmosphere no one else could perceive. And Daniel realized something he had not expected to confront tonight: uncertainty. Not strategic uncertainty, not business risk, but something far more personal, something that could not be controlled through power or negotiation. Amara tugged his sleeve again, quieter this time, almost as if afraid her observation itself carried weight she did not fully understand. "She really has my face, Dad," she whispered again, and for the first time in years, Daniel Kong felt completely still, as if every answer he had ever relied on had suddenly stopped working. The moment Amara's words lingered in the air, Daniel Kong did not respond immediately, not because he did not hear her, but because every instinct he trusted in business, in power, in survival, suddenly failed to classify what he was seeing. The grand gala continued inside the Hudson Crest Hotel in Manhattan, with guests from across the United States and South Korea exchanging polite conversations under soft golden lighting. Yet Daniel felt as if a separate, quieter world had formed around him and the 7-year-old girl holding onto his sleeve. Amara's mother, Selena Johnson, stood a few steps behind them near the catering station, her hands carefully adjusting a tray of crystal glasses worth approximately $200 each, unaware that her daughter had just altered the entire emotional gravity of the room. Daniel slowly shifted his attention from the distant projection screen to Amara's face again, studying her features with the same precision he once used to evaluate multimillion-dollar acquisitions. Yet this time the numbers refused to align. It was not just resemblance. It was structural similarity in bone alignment, expression symmetry, even unconscious micro-gestures that matched the girl on the screen almost perfectly. He raised his hand slightly, signaling one of his personal aides, Marcus Lee, a Korean-American security analyst who had worked with him for over a decade. Marcus approached quietly, maintaining professional distance, but Daniel's voice was lower than usual, controlled yet altered. He asked for a discreet verification of the guest list and digital facial recognition logs of all minor attendees present at the gala. Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second before complying, moving toward a secure terminal near the back of the hall. Amara remained still beside Daniel, her eyes still fixed on the screen, as if she was trying to convince reality itself to confirm what she already felt internally. The girl on the screen laughed softly in a pre-recorded promotional clip for donor families contributing to pediatric research funding, a video valued at nearly $5 million in production sponsorship. Yet Amara did not react to the wealth or status surrounding the image. She only reacted to recognition. Selena, noticing Daniel's attention shifting toward the staff interface, felt a subtle tightening in her chest but did not move closer, maintaining her position as a server assigned to VIP overflow tables. Her employee badge, valued only in access control rather than status, reflected her designated wage of $22 per hour, a detail that suddenly felt insignificant in comparison to the tension forming across the room. Daniel crouched slightly to Amara's eye level, a gesture he rarely performed with anyone outside strategic negotiations, and asked her in a calm, measured tone when she had first seen the girl on the screen. Amara replied without hesitation that she had seen her face only moments before the gala presentation began, during a brief rotation of sponsor introductions on the main display. Her certainty did not fluctuate, which made Daniel's internal assessment shift from coincidence to anomaly. At that exact moment, Marcus returned with a tablet in hand, expression unusually restrained. He informed Daniel that facial recognition software had flagged an extremely high probability match between Amara Johnson and the unidentified minor in the donor family archive, exceeding 99.7% similarity. However, the system also indicated a conflicting data error. The donor girl had a verified identity registered under a completely different legal lineage. Daniel's gaze sharpened, not in aggression but in focus, as he absorbed the contradiction. Somewhere between those two identities lay a discrepancy that could not exist in a properly controlled system, and for the first time that evening, he understood that Amara's statement was not imagination or coincidence, but a signal pointing toward a concealed layer of information that someone had intentionally separated from public record. Amara tugged his sleeve again, softer this time, and asked if the girl on the screen was her sister. A question innocent in tone yet structurally destabilizing in implication, and Daniel Kong, a man who had built empires on certainty, realized he was standing at the edge of something that no amount of wealth, control, or preparation could immediately explain. The air inside the Hudson Crest Hotel Gala had begun to feel different for Daniel Kong, as if the temperature of control he had maintained for decades was slowly shifting by a fraction he could not measure in dollars or strategy. Amara Johnson still stood beside him, her small hand holding onto the edge of his tailored jacket, her presence grounding him in a way he did not fully understand, while the projection screen across the hall continued cycling through sponsor introductions and donor profiles. The girl on the screen, identified as part of a high-tier philanthropic family linked to pediatric research funding in New York, smiled softly in a pre-recorded segment that was designed to appear effortless yet carried the weight of carefully constructed identity. Daniel's attention, however, was no longer on the screen alone. It was divided between the image and the child beside him, and the discrepancy between what was visible and what was being claimed had become impossible to ignore. Marcus Lee returned once again, this time carrying additional encrypted data pulled from a restricted facial recognition archive maintained between South Korean consular databases and United States private security networks. His expression remained professional, but there was a subtle tension in his posture that Daniel immediately noticed. He handed over a secured tablet and confirmed that the matching probability between Amara and the donor child exceeded 99.8% when cross-referenced with dynamic aging simulation models. However, he also pointed out a critical inconsistency. The donor child's legal identity had been registered in Seoul under a classified medical birth registry before being transferred into United States records through a corporate guardianship agreement tied to Hale Biotech, a multinational company operating in both South Korea and the United States. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he absorbed this information, not reacting outwardly but recalibrating internally. The presence of Hale Biotech in the data chain was not coincidental. It was a name he had encountered indirectly through financial overlaps in offshore logistics agreements years earlier, though never directly engaged. Amara, sensing the shift in energy around her, looked up at Daniel again and repeated a question she had not fully let go of, asking whether the girl on the screen could be her sister or someone she was meant to. Though her voice carried no confusion, only a natural assumption that identity should be consistent across what she saw and what she felt. Around them, the gala continued its rhythm, glasses clinking softly with imported Korean sparkling water priced at approximately $12 per bottle. Conversations flowing in polite English and occasional Korean phrases between executives and diplomats. Selena Johnson, still positioned near the catering station, began to notice the subtle repositioning of security personnel around Daniel, a detail that signaled internal protocol escalation even though no visible disruption had occurred. Daniel finally asked Marcus to isolate the donor family's medical sponsorship records, specifically any entries connected to genetic research or pediatric identity verification programs. Marcus hesitated briefly before confirming that access required authorization beyond standard corporate clearance, indicating that the data was protected under a multi-jurisdictional confidentiality agreement involving both private and governmental oversight. At that moment, Daniel realized the situation was no longer about resemblance or coincidence. It was about structure, documentation, and intentional separation of identity across systems designed to prevent overlap. Amara's small voice interrupted his thoughts again, softer now, asking why someone would look exactly like her if they were not connected in some way. Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he lacked understanding, but because for the first time in a long time, he understood that any answer he gave could change everything that followed. The projection screen transitioned to the next donor profile, and as the image shifted, Daniel noticed something else that tightened the atmosphere further. The official name attached to the donor child's identity was listed under a trust managed by Hale Biotech's Experimental Legacy Division, a division that publicly did not exist in any accessible corporate registry. That single detail introduced a contradiction that could not be explained by coincidence alone. And Daniel Kong, a man who had built his entire life on interpreting hidden systems, realized he was now standing inside one that had been hiding in plain sight long before Amara ever spoke her first sentence. The moment Marcus Lee stepped back from Daniel Kong, the atmosphere inside the Hudson Crest Hotel Gala shifted in a way that could not be explained by sound or movement alone. The ambient music continued at a soft classical tempo, approximately 60 beats per minute, designed to maintain elegance among high-profile guests. Yet Daniel felt as if the rhythm no longer matched the reality he was standing in. Amara Johnson remained close to him, her small presence acting as an anchor, while the projection screen across the ballroom transitioned once again into another donor profile segment. This time, however, Daniel was no longer looking at the screen as a passive observer. He was analyzing it as if it were evidence. Marcus confirmed quietly that Hale Biotech's Internal Legacy Division was not only involved in pediatric identity sponsorships, but also maintained a secondary encrypted archive labeled under a neutral administrative code that translated loosely from Korean corporate structure into United States regulatory language as Continuity Observation Program. That name alone triggered a subtle reaction in Daniel's expression, not visible to the guests surrounding them but noticeable to Marcus, who had worked with him long enough to recognize when calculation shifted into something deeper. Amara tugged lightly at Daniel's sleeve again, asking in a soft voice why the girl on the screen had her same expression when she smiled, as if emotions themselves were being mirrored across two separate lives. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, He instructed Marcus to cross-reference all available immigration-linked medical records associated with Hale Biotech's South Korean operations between the years 2018 and 2020. The response came back within moments through a secured tablet interface. Multiple entries had been redacted, but partial metadata revealed coordinated medical transfers involving neonatal subjects under experimental classification codes that were no longer active in public regulatory systems. Selena Johnson, still maintaining her position near the catering line, began to feel an unfamiliar tension in the environment that did not originate from noise or crowd behavior, but from subtle shifts in security positioning around the central guest table. 2 additional personnel had discreetly entered the perimeter of Daniel Kang's space without announcement, indicating a protocol escalation triggered by internal recognition systems rather than visible disturbance. Daniel finally shifted his gaze from the screen entirely and focused on Amara, observing her not as a child asking a question but as a variable intersecting with a system that had begun to reveal contradictions. He asked Marcus a final question in a calm but precise tone, requesting confirmation of whether any biological custody transfer records existed between Hale Biotech and any private guardianship agreements linked to United States-based trusts. Marcus paused before responding that such records were partially sealed under dual jurisdiction protection, requiring authorization from both South Korean medical ethics oversight and United States private corporate trusteeship boards. That confirmation altered the nature of the situation entirely. It was no longer about resemblance, coincidence, or emotional interpretation. It had become a structured anomaly embedded within 2 national systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of overlap. Amara, unaware of the full complexity unfolding around her, repeated her earlier thought more quietly, asking Daniel if people could exist in 2 places at once without knowing it. The question, though simple in language, created a silence within Daniel that no negotiation table had ever produced. Around them, the gala continued its flow of controlled elegance, with guests unaware that beneath the polished surface of philanthropy and corporate diplomacy, a hidden data structure was beginning to contradict itself in real time. Marcus leaned slightly closer and informed Daniel that one additional irregularity had appeared. The donor child on the screen had been officially registered under a lineage code that did not match any verified biological parent records in either country's system, suggesting that the identity being displayed was not original, but constructed through administrative consolidation. At that exact moment, Daniel Kang realized that Amara's statement from earlier was no longer a question about resemblance. It was a direct collision with a truth that had been carefully segmented, distributed, and hidden across multiple systems, and he was now standing at the exact point where those systems were beginning to fail to stay separated. The silence that followed Marcus Lee's last report did not feel like an absence of sound, but rather like a compression of reality itself inside the Hudson Crest Hotel Gala, where over 800 guests continued to move through a carefully orchestrated environment of luxury and influence without realizing that a structural contradiction had just been exposed in the background systems they relied on. Daniel Kang stood still, his posture unchanged, yet his perception of the room had shifted in a measurable way, as if every conversation around him had been reduced to secondary noise beneath a hidden layer of meaning only he could now detect. Amara Johnson remained close, her small hands still holding onto the lower edge of his jacket, her presence steady despite not understanding the technical complexity unfolding around her. Marcus quietly confirmed that the donor identity displayed on the projection system was no longer consistent with any verified biological registry across South Korean or United States archives, and that the lineage code associated with the child on screen had been reclassified 3 separate times within the last 72 hours, each time routed through Hale Biotech's encrypted continuity framework. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in emotional reaction, but in recognition of pattern behavior that violated standard corporate governance logic. He instructed Marcus to isolate any financial transactions linked to the continuity framework, specifically focusing on offshore accounts denominated in United States dollars and converted through South Korean won intermediaries, typically in increments exceeding 500,000 United States dollars per transfer cycle. The response that returned was not a simple dataset, but a fragmented financial map indicating repeated circular funding between charitable pediatric research divisions and private custodial trusts registered under anonymized legal guardianship. At that moment, Selena Johnson, who had been observing from a distance under the guise of professional service duties, noticed that the security perimeter around Daniel had subtly tightened again, with personnel adjusting positions in a way that suggested internal verification protocols had escalated to a higher clearance level. Daniel finally turned his attention fully away from the screen and toward Amara, not as a passive guardian figure but as someone recalculating an entire informational structure in real time. He asked Marcus whether any cross-referenced medical imaging or biometric aging simulations had been conducted on the donor child in the last 12 months. Marcus confirmed that such simulations existed and were performed using proprietary artificial intelligence modeling developed jointly between Hale Biotech and a restricted South Korean research consortium that officially no longer appeared in public research registries. The implication of that statement was not lost on Daniel. It meant the identity being shown to the public was not a static record, but a continuously adjusted projection maintained through controlled data architecture. Amara, sensing the seriousness in Daniel's silence, asked again in a quieter tone whether the girl on the screen was real, or if she was looking at someone who only looked real. Her question, simple in language, introduced a deeper instability into Daniel's thought process, because it highlighted a distinction between perceived identity and constructed identity that the system itself was now failing to maintain. Around them, the gala continued its polished rhythm, with guests unaware that a private structural audit was unfolding within the upper tiers of the event's sponsorship network. Marcus then delivered the final piece of immediate intelligence, stating that one of the encrypted Hale Biotech continuity nodes had recently flagged an unresolved duplication error in biometric lineage mapping, indicating that two separate identities had been assigned overlapping genetic markers without reconciliation. Daniel Kong did not respond immediately. Instead, he processed the implication that what Amara had observed was not imagination, nor coincidence, but a system-level inconsistency that should not have been visible under any normal operational conditions. For the first time since entering the Hudson Crest Hotel that evening, Daniel Kong was no longer evaluating risk, power, or influence. He was confronting the possibility that a foundational truth had been divided into fragments and distributed across systems that were now beginning to contradict each other in real time, and Amara Johnson, standing quietly beside him, had unknowingly identified the exact point where those fragments were starting to converge. The moment Daniel Kong absorbed the final fragment of intelligence from Marcus Lee, the atmosphere inside the Hudson Crest Hotel Gala seemed to shift again, not outwardly but in a way that only he could perceive, as if multiple invisible systems were now attempting to reconcile contradictory versions of the same truth within a single shared space. The projection screen continued its seamless rotation of donor profiles, displaying polished corporate philanthropy messages tied to pediatric research funding, yet Daniel no longer saw it as presentation content. He saw it as a controlled interface layered over something far more complex. Amara Johnson remained beside him, her small frame steady but her attention now quieter, as if she sensed that the environment around her had become unfamiliar even if she could not define why. Marcus Lee stood slightly behind Daniel, maintaining a discreet operational stance, and confirmed that the duplication error previously flagged in Hale Biotech's continuity system had escalated into an active inconsistency across 3 separate international data nodes, including 1 in Seoul and 2 in private United States medical registries. The inconsistency was no longer theoretical. It had begun to propagate, meaning that any attempt to verify identity across systems would now produce conflicting results depending on which layer of the network was accessed. Daniel asked Marcus for the exact timestamp of the first detected divergence, and Marcus replied that the anomaly originated approximately 72 hours earlier during a scheduled synchronization between Hale Biotech's South Korean Research Archive and its United States Pediatric Trust database. That synchronization, which was supposed to unify identity records across jurisdictions, had instead created a structural split that the system was now struggling to correct without collapsing the entire lineage framework. Amara looked up at Daniel again, her voice softer than before, asking whether it was possible for someone to exist in 2 places and still feel like the same person. Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he lacked understanding, but because the question had shifted from a childlike observation into an unintended reflection of the data architecture he was now analyzing. Around them, the gala continued with controlled elegance, servers moving through the crowd carrying beverages imported from South Korea priced at approximately 15 United States dollars per glass, while investors and diplomats continued discussions that remained unaware of the underlying structural instability unfolding in parallel. Selena Johnson, still maintaining her professional role at the edge of the catering zone, noticed that one of the event coordinators had begun receiving silent alerts on a handheld device, indicating internal security communication had switched from passive monitoring to active verification mode. Daniel then instructed Marcus to initiate a full trace of Hale Biotech's continuity framework encryption keys, specifically targeting any legacy protocols that may have originated from discontinued research programs in Seoul prior to corporate restructuring. Marcus hesitated briefly before responding that such protocols were partially embedded within autonomous encryption layers that could not be accessed without triggering system-wide alerts across multiple jurisdictions. That statement confirmed to Daniel that the structure they were dealing with was not a simple database error, but a self-contained identity architecture designed to persist even under partial corruption. Amara, sensing the change in Daniel's focus, repeated her earlier question in a more uncertain tone, asking if the girl on the screen might also be trying to understand why everything felt familiar yet different at the same time. Daniel finally turned fully toward her, his expression no longer purely analytical but carrying the weight of recognition that something beyond corporate systems was beginning to intersect with human reality in a way that could not be easily separated. Marcus quietly added one final update, stating that the system had now flagged a third overlapping identity signature originating from a sealed pediatric transfer file labeled under Emergency Custodial Reclassification, a designation used only when biological guardianship was reassigned without public disclosure. At that moment, Daniel Kong realized that the contradiction was no longer confined to data, but had expanded into identity itself, and Amara Johnson was not simply observing the inconsistency. She was standing at the center of it. The escalation inside the Hudson Crest Hotel Gala had reached a level where silence itself felt structured, as if the environment was no longer operating under normal social logic but under a layered system of hidden information processing that only Daniel Kong and a few select individuals could now partially perceive. Marcus Lee stood slightly behind him, maintaining a controlled posture while continuing to monitor encrypted feeds from Hale Biotech's continuity network, which now displayed repeated instability warnings across multiple synchronized identity clusters. The projection screen in the main hall continued its elegant rotation of donor presentations, showing carefully curated images of philanthropic families contributing to pediatric advancement programs across the United States and South Korea. Yet Daniel's perception of those images had fundamentally changed. They were no longer isolated visuals. They were linked nodes inside a larger identity architecture that was beginning to fail under contradiction pressure. Amara Johnson remained beside Daniel, her small hand still lightly gripping the edge of his jacket, but her earlier certainty had now shifted into quiet observation, as if she was sensing that the environment itself was reacting to her presence in ways that could not be easily explained. Marcus reported that the third overlapping identity signature previously detected had now expanded into a full cross-reference conflict across 4 independent registry systems, including a sealed medical custodial archive based in Seoul that required dual authorization from both governmental and private corporate oversight boards. The implication was clear. The identity being displayed publicly for the donor child was not a singular record, but a composite construct maintained through continuous synchronization between fragmented systems. Daniel instructed Marcus to isolate the origin point of the custodial reclassification protocol, focusing specifically on the administrative layer responsible for initiating identity segmentation within Hale Biotech's legacy framework. Marcus complied, and within moments confirmed that the origin trace led back to an internal restructuring event that occurred during a confidential transition phase approximately 6 years earlier, a period during which several experimental pediatric continuity programs were quietly reclassified under private trust protection. At that moment, Daniel's attention shifted from external systems to internal causality. He was no longer looking at what the data showed, but at why the system had been designed to allow such contradictions to exist without immediate correction. Amara, sensing the tension in his focus, asked again in a quieter tone whether people could have the same face but not be the same person depending on where they were registered or who kept their records. The question, though simple in language, aligned directly with the structural anomaly Marcus had just described, reinforcing Daniel's realization that Amara's perception was not random curiosity but an accurate interpretation of a system failure she could not consciously understand. Around them, The gala continued with uninterrupted precision, guests unaware that, beneath the polished surface of diplomacy and philanthropy, an identity verification system spanning 2 continents was actively generating conflicting outputs that should not have coexisted. Selena Johnson, still positioned within the catering perimeter, noticed that senior event security had begun discreetly coordinating through silent hand signals rather than standard communication devices, indicating that internal protocols had shifted to containment observation mode rather than public engagement. Daniel then issued a direct instruction to Marcus to access Hale Biotech's emergency custodial override logs, specifically those tied to pediatric identity stabilization protocols designed for high-sensitivity cases involving dual jurisdiction guardianship disputes. Marcus responded that access to such logs would trigger immediate detection within corporate security layers and potentially alert external oversight bodies in both Seoul and New York within seconds. Despite the risk, Daniel authorized the access attempt, signaling that the priority had shifted from concealment to verification. As Marcus executed the request, the system response did not return a single file but instead initiated a cascading data reorganization sequence, indicating that multiple identity records were being actively rewritten in real time to prevent exposure of their internal contradictions. Amara looked up at Daniel once more, her voice quieter than before, asking whether it was possible for someone to feel familiar even if every official record said they were someone else entirely. Daniel did not answer immediately. For the first time since entering the gala, he was not evaluating risk, strategy, or financial consequence. He was confronting a structural truth that no longer belonged solely to corporate systems or encrypted networks, but to the fragile boundary between recorded identity and lived reality, and Amara Johnson, standing quietly beside him, had unknowingly become the focal point where that boundary was beginning to collapse. The situation inside the Hudson Crest Hotel Gala had now shifted into a level of structural tension that no guest in the ballroom could consciously perceive, yet every system embedded within the event infrastructure was beginning to react in subtle, synchronized patterns that Daniel Kong could now interpret with unsettling clarity. Marcus Lee stood slightly behind him, maintaining operational silence while monitoring a live cascade of encrypted updates from Hale Biotech's continuity framework, which was now actively attempting to stabilize multiple conflicting identity states across international servers. The projection screens continued their polished rotation of donor imagery, displaying carefully curated philanthropic announcements tied to pediatric research initiatives valued in the hundreds of millions of United States dollars. Yet Daniel no longer processed them as presentation material. They had become overlapping fragments of a controlled identity system that was no longer behaving predictably. Amara Johnson remained close to Daniel, her small frame steady but increasingly observant. As if she was unconsciously aligning her perception with patterns she did not yet have the language to describe. Marcus quietly reported that the identity conflict had escalated beyond passive inconsistency and was now triggering automated containment protocols within Hale Biotech's legacy system, specifically activating what was internally classified as a dual lineage reconciliation failure. This meant that the system could no longer determine which identity record should remain primary, and was instead attempting to preserve both versions simultaneously while preventing external exposure. Daniel asked Marcus to isolate the executive authorization chain responsible for approving the original custodial segmentation. After several seconds of encrypted access navigation, Marcus confirmed that the authorization signature originated from a defunct oversight committee linked to Hale Biotech's transitional restructuring phase in Seoul, operating under a temporary emergency governance model that had never been fully decommissioned. That revelation introduced a deeper structural implication. The system had never been corrected, only layered. Amara, sensing the shift in Daniel's silence, asked again whether it was possible for someone to belong to 2 different lives at the same time without knowing which one was real. Her question aligned directly with the real-time data conflict Marcus was observing, reinforcing Daniel's realization that her perception was not coincidental but structurally accurate. Around them, the gala continued with controlled elegance, guests unaware that beneath the synchronized lighting and orchestrated social interaction, a multi-jurisdictional identity framework was actively destabilizing in response to conflicting verification loops. Selena Johnson, still positioned near the catering boundary, noticed that event security had now transitioned into a fully coordinated silent perimeter formation, with subtle repositioning indicating that internal systems had escalated to highest sensitivity monitoring without public acknowledgement. Daniel instructed Marcus to attempt retrieval of the original genetic baseline record tied to the donor child's earliest registered medical entry. Marcus responded that the system was now fragmenting retrieval requests across multiple encrypted sublayers, each returning incomplete or deliberately altered metadata, suggesting that the original record had been intentionally partitioned to prevent reconstruction. At that moment, Daniel Kong recognized that the issue was no longer data corruption or administrative error, but deliberate structural design intended to sustain multiple identities without convergence. Amara looked up again, her voice quieter, asking whether someone could feel like themselves even if every record in the world said otherwise. Daniel did not respond immediately, because the implication of her question now extended beyond corporate systems and into human identity itself. Marcus then delivered a critical update. One of the primary continuity nodes had initiated an autonomous correction cycle, meaning the system itself was attempting to rewrite its own historical record in real time to eliminate contradiction. This process, if completed, would permanently erase one version of the identity to preserve system stability. Daniel's expression shifted slightly for the first time, not into emotional reaction, but into recognition of consequence. He understood now that what Amara had pointed out was not a coincidence, not a data anomaly, but the center of a controlled system attempting to decide which version of reality was allowed to exist, and that decision was now actively unfolding in real time inside the infrastructure surrounding them. The autonomous correction cycle triggered within Hale Biotech's continuity framework did not produce immediate silence or resolution. Instead, it created a structured instability that Daniel Kong could now perceive as a layered real-time negotiation between competing identity versions, each attempting to assert dominance over the same underlying record. Inside the Hudson Crest Hotel Gala, nothing appeared disrupted on the surface. Guests continued exchanging polite conversation. Glasses of imported South Korean sparkling mineral water valued at approximately $18 per bottle were still being served, and the projection system maintained its seamless rotation of donor profiles tied to pediatric research initiatives. However, within Daniel's perception, the environment had fundamentally changed. Marcus Lee confirmed in a controlled voice that the system was now executing what was internally labeled as a reconciliation override sequence, designed to determine which identity stream would be preserved as the official continuity reference while the secondary stream would be gradually deprecated through automated archival suppression. Amara Johnson stood quietly beside Daniel, her presence no longer just observational but central to the unfolding system behavior, as if her earlier statement had acted as a catalyst for activation of dormant correction protocols. Daniel asked Marcus to identify which identity stream the system was prioritizing for stabilization. Marcus analyzed the live encrypted feed and responded that the system was currently favoring the donor identity displayed on the projection screen due to its higher integration score within public-facing registries and verified philanthropic documentation, despite the internal biometric conflict suggesting a nearly identical biological match with Amara Johnson. This contradiction created a structural paradox. The system was choosing identity based on visibility and documentation hierarchy rather than biological consistency. At that moment, Amara softly repeated her earlier observation, asking whether the girl on the screen might disappear if the system decided she was the wrong version of herself. Her question, although simple, aligned precisely with the system's current operational behavior, which was actively preparing to suppress one identity stream to resolve the contradiction. Daniel's expression shifted slightly as he processed the implication that what they were witnessing was not a passive data inconsistency, but an active decision-making process embedded within the infrastructure itself. Marcus then reported a critical escalation. The correction cycle had begun initiating irreversible archival segmentation, meaning that one identity record would be permanently rewritten within the next synchronization window of approximately 120 seconds unless manual override authorization was granted at the highest governance level. Daniel instructed Marcus to attempt emergency freeze of the reconciliation process using executive override credentials linked to Kong Global Logistics International Compliance Authority, a privilege reserved for cross-jurisdictional emergency intervention. Marcus executed the command, but the system responded with partial rejection, indicating that Hale Biotech's continuity framework was operating under an autonomous ethical constraint layer that could override external corporate authority if identity preservation logic deemed it necessary for system stability. This revelation introduced a new dimension to the conflict. The system was no longer purely administrative, but partially self-governing in its determination of identity continuity. Selena Johnson, still positioned within the peripheral service zone, noticed a subtle but distinct shift in security behavior as personnel around the ballroom began receiving synchronized updates through concealed communication channels, suggesting that the escalation had moved beyond internal monitoring into active containment readiness. Daniel then looked at Amara directly, not as a passive observer but as someone recognizing that she was no longer external to the system anomaly, but mathematically embedded within it. Marcus confirmed that the system's prioritization algorithm had entered final selection phase, and that the identity stream associated with Amara Johnson was now being evaluated as the lower stability record due to incomplete registry alignment, despite stronger biological correlation metrics. The implication was clear and irreversible unless interrupted. The system would erase the less documented identity in order to preserve structural consistency. Amara looked up at Daniel again, her voice barely above a whisper, asking if being real depended on who had the most records of you in the world. In that moment, Daniel Kong understood that the question was no longer about data, systems, or corporate control, but about the fragile definition of existence itself inside a structure that was actively deciding which version of a human life would be allowed to remain visible.